That night, she learned her first rule of survival. You can't hold on to anything in a world designed to take everything away. The engines roared through the rain as the royal plane ripped through the pitch-black sky above Greece. Inside, the air was thick with a fear heavier than the baggage they had left behind. King Constantine's hands trembled on the controls. Queen Mother Frederica prayed softly in the dark, but her youngest daughter, Princess Irene, just gazed out the cold window, watching the lights of Athens fade into the distance, knowing that each flicker of light was a piece of her life being erased forever. When they landed hours later on an unfamiliar runway in Rome, their crowns meant nothing. They had escaped the soldiers' guns, but they could not escape their fate. They were now exiles, strangers without a home, without a flag, without a future. For 25-year-old Princess Irene, it was a moment of profound, shattering silence. In that terrifying silence, Irene realized something no royal tutor had ever taught her, that everything we call ours, name, country, even memories, can vanish overnight. And when that happens, the only thing left to protect is the soul. So while others fought desperately to reclaim the crown, Irene turned her back. She stepped out of the glory of history and into its shadows. She traded palaces for temples, jewels for simple cotton, and the clamor of politics for the quietude of wisdom. But to understand how a young woman could let go of power so easily, and how she could look upon the wreckage of her life with such strange calm, we cannot just look at that stormy night in 1967. The truth is, this resilience was not learned in a moment. That night of escape was not a new tragedy for Irene. It was a return to her destiny. Unlike her royal cousins, born into the safety of European palaces, Irene was never a princess in a glass tower. The title of exiled princess did not wait until she was 25 to find her. It was in her blood from her very first breath. The year was 1942. Europe was bleeding. The Nazi war machine had crushed the continent, and the swastika flew over the Acropolis in Athens. The Greek royal family, King George II, Crown Prince Paul, and Crown Princess Frederica, had barely escaped with their lives. They were a dynasty on the run, fleeing first to Crete, then to Egypt, and finally pushed further south by the advancing perils of war to the very tip of the African continent. It was here, in Cape Town, South Africa, that Irene was born. There were no 21-gun salutes echoing over the Aegean Sea. There were no crowds cheering in Syntagma Square. Irene entered the world on May 11th, 1942, in a borrowed house, dependent on the charity of strangers. Her very first breath was drawn in exile. This is crucial to understanding her character. Unlike British royals, who are born into the stability of Buckingham Palace, Irene was born into a suitcase. She was a stateless princess before she could even speak. Her godfather was not a European monarch, but General Jan Smuts, the Prime Minister of South Africa. Smuts was a philosopher-statesman, a man of deep intellect who saw something special in the exiled Greek family. He took them under his wing, and in many ways the vast, open landscapes of South Africa imprinted on Irene's soul long before she ever saw the crowded streets of Athens. She was a child of the horizon, not a child of the court. From the beginning, she was different. Her sister Sophia was the dutiful eldest, already learning the rigid posture of a future queen. Her brother Constantine was the heir, the golden boy, upon whom all political hopes rested. Irene, the third child, was the observer. In the psychology of royal families, the third child is often the spare to the spare, relieved of the crushing pressure of succession, but often left without a clear purpose. For Irene, this lack of defined purpose became her greatest freedom. The House of Glücksburg was not originally Greek. They were Danish princes imported in the 1860s to bring stability to the volatile Greek state. They were always viewed with a mix of adoration and suspicion. They were foreign, yet they tried harder than anyone to be Greek. The family motto might as well have been, "Pack your bags." By the time Irene was born, the Greek kings had been deposed, exiled, and recalled so many times it had become a grim family tradition. Her father, Paul, was a man of immense dignity but deep melancholy. He was a gentle giant who preferred the piano and spiritual books to the machinations of politics. He wore the crown like a crown of thorns. Irene adored him. She inherited his sensitivity, his love for music, and his quiet, introspective nature. Her mother, Frederica, was the opposite. A granddaughter of Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany, Frederica was a force of nature, brilliant, charismatic, manipulative, and terrifyingly ambitious. She was a woman who believed in the divine right of kings with a medieval intensity. She loved her children fiercely, but she loved the throne even more. If Paul was the heart of the family, Frederica was the iron spine. Irene grew up in the shadow of this overpowering maternal figure, learning early on that in her family, love came wrapped in duty. In 1946, a referendum summoned the royal family back to Greece. The exile was over, or so they thought. But the Greece they returned to was not a paradise. It was a graveyard. The country had been ravaged by World War II and was now plunging headfirst into a vicious civil war between the government and communist insurgents. Irene was only 4 years old when she first set foot on Greek soil. Her earliest memories were not of ballrooms, but of a country starving. She saw villages burned to the ground. She saw children her own age with hollow eyes and distended bellies. The royal family didn't hide in the palace. Queen Frederica dragged them to the front lines. She organized the Queen's camps to shelter orphans and children displaced by the war. While historians debate the political motivations behind these camps, for a young Irene, the experience was visceral. She saw suffering up close. She saw that being a princess wasn't about wearing pretty dresses. It was about walking through hospitals smelling of antiseptic and blood. It was about smiling when you wanted to cry. This exposure to raw human misery at such a young age shattered any illusions of fairy tale royalty. It planted a seed in Irene that would bloom decades later, a realization that titles cannot save you from pain, and that true nobility lies in service, not status. Once the Civil War ended in 1949, the family settled into life at Tatoi Palace, a lush estate in the woods north of Athens. This was their sanctuary. Here, the royal children lived a life that was strangely isolated. They were schooled at home, primarily by tutors. However, Irene didn't confine herself to her ivory tower. She was sent to Schule Schloss Salem in Germany, a prestigious and highly disciplined boarding school in Europe, where great personalities were forged. There, Irene's intelligence became evident. Not only was she fluent in several languages, a royal standard, but she also had an obsessive passion for archaeology. Few know that the young princess, along with her professor, published a serious research paper entitled En Decilia, Fragmentos Keramicos de Decilia y Miscellanea Archaeologica. For Irene, archaeology wasn't just a hobby. It was her way of connecting with history. They had few friends outside of their royal cousins. It was a glasshouse existence. Inside, everything was perfect. Outside, the political storms were always gathering. At Tatoi, the roles of the three children solidified. Constantine was being trained to rule. He was athletic, charming, and outgoing. Everything a king should be. Sophia was being trained to marry. She was serious, intellectual, and prepared to be the consort of a great European power. And Irene? Irene retreated into music. It was discovered early on that Irene possessed a prodigious talent for the piano. This wasn't just the polite tinkling of a society girl. This was raw, professional-grade talent. Her parents hired the legendary Greek pianist Gina Bacauer to teach her. Bacauer, a titan of the classical music world, was not one to flatter royalty. If Irene had been mediocre, Bacauer would have left. Instead, she stayed. The piano became Irene's voice. In a family dominated by her mother's thunderous personality and the political weight on her father and brother, Irene found that she could express her deepest emotions only through the keys of a Steinway. She would practice for hours, losing herself in Bach and Beethoven. Music was a world where there were no voters, no communists, no coups, and no protocols. There was only truth. Observers from that time recall a shy, slightly awkward teenager who seemed uncomfortable in formal gowns, but transformed the moment she sat at the piano. There was a melancholy in her playing that hinted at a loneliness she couldn't articulate. She was the introvert of the family, the one who would rather read a book on archaeology than cut a ribbon at a bridge opening. As the 1950s turned into the 1960s, the royal marriage market began to churn. Queen Frederica was determined to secure brilliant matches for her children. She set her sights high. Sofia was successfully matched with the Juan Carlos of Spain, a union that would eventually restore the Spanish monarchy. It was a grand dynastic triumph. Constantine was married to the beautiful Princess Anne-Marie of Denmark, creating a picture-perfect young royal couple. But Irene remained singular. It wasn't for a lack of suitors. She was a princess of Greece and Denmark, intelligent, talented, and possessing a quiet, classical beauty. Her name was whispered in connection with Prince Michel of Orleans and various German high nobility. The gossip columns of Point de Vue and Hola were desperate to marry her off. But Irene was already showing signs of the stubborn independence that would define her life. She saw the reality of royal marriages. She saw that they were often business transactions, alliances signed in ink and sealed with a loveless ceremony. She watched her sister Sofia navigate the complex, often lonely waters of her marriage to Juan Carlos. Irene wanted something else. She once famously said, "I never met a man I admired enough to lose my freedom for." Think about the weight of that statement. In the 1960s, a princess was property of the state. Her womb was a national asset. For Irene to prioritize her freedom over her duty to reproduce was a quiet act of rebellion. She wasn't rejecting love, she was rejecting the performance of love. She chose to remain at Tatoi, by her father's side. The idyllic if fragile world of Tatoi came crashing down in 1964. King Paul, the gentle giant whom Irene adored above all else, was diagnosed with stomach cancer. The decline was rapid. The atmosphere in the palace turned from anxiety to mourning. Irene, then only 22, became her father's nurse. She spent hours by his bedside, playing soft music, reading to him, holding his hand as the life ebbed out of him. When King Paul died on March 6, 1964, the devastation was total. For Irene, it was the loss of her anchor. Her mother Frederica was shattered, transforming overnight from a powerful political player into a grieving widow who refused to take off her black mourning weeds. Her brother Constantine was now king at only 23 years old, young, inexperienced, and facing a political viper's nest that would have terrified a veteran statesman. And suddenly, Irene's status changed. With Constantine unmarried and childless at the moment of his accession, Princess Irene became the crown princess of Greece. Between March 1964 and July 1965, she was officially the heir presumptive. the rightful heir to the throne. If Constantine had met with misfortune at that time, Irene would have been queen of the Hellenists. She was not merely a shadow beside her brother. She was the head of the corps of Greek Girl Scouts, directly leading and inspiring thousands of young girls. For a brief window of time, she was the heir presumptive. For a brief window of time, she was the heir presumptive. If anything happened to Constantine, Irene would be queen of the Hellenes. The shy pianist was thrust into the blinding center of the spotlight. She had to stand on balconies, review troops, and represent the crown. Photos from this period show a young woman performing her duty with impeccable grace, but with a haunted look in her eyes. She was wearing the sash of the Order of the Redeemer, along with the most prestigious medals from friendly royal families. The Knight of the Elephants of Denmark, the Grand Cross of Merit of the Republic of Italy, and even the Chula Chom Klau medal from Thailand. Her chest bore the recognition of the whole world, but she looked like she was wearing a straitjacket. She was supporting her brother, but she could feel the ground trembling beneath him. The golden age of the young King Constantine was short-lived. The political situation in Greece was unraveling. The Prime Minister, George Papandreou, and the palace were on a collision course. The streets of Athens were filling with protesters. The ominous rumble of tanks could be heard in the distance. Though the young royals, optimistic and perhaps naive, believed that the love of the people would protect them, they were wrong. As 1967 approached, Irene was about to face the defining moment of her life. The shy princess was about to be tested by fire in a night of terror that would strip her of her title, her home, and her nationality, leaving her with nothing but the clothes on her back and the philosophy she was just beginning to discover. The storm was about to break. History does not knock on the door, it kicks it down. For Princess Irene, the concept of home evaporated in a single night. We often think of royalty as living in a protective bubble, insulated from the shocks of the real world. But in 20th century Greece, the bubble was made of thin glass, and everyone held a stone. By 1967, Irene was 25 years old. To the outside world, she was the dutiful sister of the king, a talented concert pianist, and a quiet, mysterious figure, often seen standing a few paces behind her charismatic brother, King Constantine II, and her formidable mother, Queen Frederica. But internally, Irene was already beginning to detach. She was watching the political fabric of her country tear apart, thread by thread. The spring of 1967 felt heavy. The air in Athens was thick with strikes, protests, and the venomous rhetoric of political polarization. The young king, only 26, was trying to navigate a ship through a hurricane. Inside Totoi Palace, the mood was tense. There were whispers of conspiracies, of military dissatisfaction, of communist uprisings. But no one, not even the king, guessed how close the knife really was. It happened at 2 a.m., the darkest hour of the night. At Totoi Palace, the royal family was asleep. The residence, nestled in the pine forest north of Athens, usually felt like a sanctuary. But that night, the silence of the forest was broken not by birds, but by the grinding mechanical roar of tank treads. The phone lines were cut. The radio went dead. Irene woke to confusion. Servants were running through the hallways, their faces pale with terror. The king's secretary rushed in with the news that would end their world. The army is moving. Athens is surrounded. This was the colonel's coup. A group of right-wing army officers, fearing a communist takeover, had decided to strangle Greek democracy in its cradle. They didn't ask the king's permission. They simply took the country. For Irene, the memory of that night is a blur of surreal horror. She watched as tanks surrounded their home, soldiers with machine guns, men who had sworn an oath of loyalty to her brother, were now pointing their weapons at the palace windows. The king was isolated. The colonels demanded he recognize their government or face a bloodbath. They had arrested the prime minister. They were arresting thousands of citizens in Athens. They held a gun to the head of the constitution. Constantine, fearing a civil war that would turn the streets of Athens red with blood, made a fateful decision. He legitimized the junta. He agreed to swear them in, hoping to buy time, to remain inside the country and organize a counter-move later. Irene stood by and watched the humiliation of her brother. The official photograph of that new government is one of the most chilling images in royal history. The king stands in the center, unsmiling, looking physically ill. The colonels stand around him, looking like predators who have just trapped a lion. And somewhere in the background of those days, Irene was watching. She saw how quickly power evaporates. She saw that a king without an army is just a man in a suit. For the next 8 months, the royal family lived as prisoners in their own palace. They were shadowed by the secret police. Their mail was opened. Their phone calls were monitored. Irene, once the carefree pianist, now played her music to drown out the sound of anxiety. She stopped being a princess and became a conspirator. From April to December 1967, Tatoi Palace became a nest of spies. King Constantine was not content to be a puppet for the dictatorship. He was planning a counter-coup. He wanted to rally the loyal troops in northern Greece, march on Athens, and restore democracy. It was a plan born of bravery, but also of desperation. Irene was in the thick of it. She was her mother's constant companion, and Queen Frederica, the old lioness, was deeply involved in the strategy. They had to speak in code. They couldn't trust the palace staff. Every dinner conversation was a performance. They had to pretend everything was normal while secretly packing their bags for war. Imagine the psychological toll on Irene. She was 25. She should have been going to parties or preparing for a wedding. Instead, she was living in a thriller movie. She learned to read faces, to detect lies, to suppress her fear. The plan was set for December 13th, 1967. The king's birthday was coming up. The colonels were relaxed, thinking they had broken the king's spirit. It was the perfect moment to strike. But the plan was flawed. It relied on too many ifs. It relied on the weather, on secure communications, and on the hope that the Greek people would instantly rise up to support the king. On the morning of December 13th, the royal family did not wake up to a normal day. They woke up to flee. This was not an orderly departure. It was a frantic scramble. The king, Queen Anne-Marie, Queen Mother Frederica, and Princess Irene piled into the royal aircraft at Tatoi Air Base. The king himself took the controls of the plane. He was a skilled pilot, an Olympian gold medalist, a man of action. But as they took off, heading north toward the city of Kavala, the atmosphere was thick with dread. They were leaving Athens. If this failed, they could never return. They landed in Kavala, a city in northern Greece that was supposed to be loyal. At first it seemed to work. The local generals welcomed the king. The navy remained loyal. Irene and the family were whisked to a hotel, waiting for the news that the rest of the army had joined them. But the news never came. The counter-coup was a disaster. The communications failed. The orders didn't get through. The junta in Athens moved faster than the king. They broadcasted propaganda saying the king had kidnapped himself or was trying to destroy the country. The army units the king was counting on were neutralized or confused. For 24 agonizing hours, Irene sat in a cold room in northern Greece, listening to the radio static, watching the rain lash against the window. She watched her brother's face transform from determination to despair. The realization hit them like a physical blow. We have lost. The junta's columns were advancing on Kavala. If they stayed, they would be arrested, perhaps executed, or at best used as permanent hostages. There was only one choice left: run. The escape of December 14th, 1967, is one of the most dramatic episodes in modern royal history. It is the scene that should be in every movie, yet is rarely spoken of. It was the dead of night. A torrential storm was raging over the Aegean Sea. The royal family rushed back to the small airfield at Kavala. They had one plane, a Gulfstream turboprop. The plane was designed for a few passengers. It was now carrying the king, the queen, two royal babies, the queen mother, Irene, the prime minister, and a handful of loyal staff. It was dangerously overloaded. To make matters worse, they couldn't fully refuel. The junta's forces were closing in. They had to take off now. King Constantine sat in the pilot's seat again. The runway was slick with rain. As the engines roared to life, Irene sat in the back clutching the seat. The plane lumbered down the runway, heavy and sluggish. It barely cleared the fence at the end of the airstrip. They were airborne, but they were flying into a nightmare. The weather was horrific. Turbulence tossed the small plane like a toy. Inside the cabin, it was freezing cold. The heating system struggled against the altitude and the storm. Queen Anne-Marie was holding baby Prince Pavlos, trying to keep him warm. Irene sat next to her mother, Frederica. The queen mother, usually so strong, looked made of stone, staring into the dark. But the real terror was in the cockpit. The king realized they were burning fuel faster than calculated because of the headwinds and the heavy load. They were heading for Rome, but the fuel gauges were dropping toward zero. For hours they flew in silence, suspended between a homeland that wanted to arrest them and a foreign land that didn't know they were coming. Irene later recalled the sensation of total suspension. They were nowhere. They were no longer the royal family of Greece. They were just a frighteningly heavy metal tube running on fumes above the dark Mediterranean. The radio was silent. They couldn't contact Athens air traffic control for fear of being tracked and intercepted by fighter jets. They were ghosts in the sky. As dawn approached, the lights of Rome appeared on the horizon. It was a miracle. The king radioed Ciampino Airport for permission to land. The Italian air traffic controllers were confused. They hadn't received a flight plan. "Identify yourself," the tower demanded. The king's voice crackled over the radio. "This is the king of Greece." There was a pause. The controllers probably thought it was a prank, but they cleared the runway. When the plane touched down, it had fuel for perhaps 5 more minutes of flight. The engines sputtered into silence as they taxied to a halt. The door opened. The cold Italian morning air rushed in, but there was no red carpet. There was no ambassador waiting with a limousine. There was no honor guard. There were just confused airport mechanics and a few sleepy carabinieri. The image of their arrival is heartbreaking in its banality. The royal family of Greece, descendants of Queen Victoria, rulers of the Hellenes, stumbled out of the plane looking like refugees. Their clothes were wrinkled from the flight. They were exhausted, unshaven, and shivering. They had no luggage. In the haste to leave Kavala, they had left almost everything behind. Irene walked down the stairs of the plane and stepped onto the tarmac. She had nothing but the clothes on her back. No toothbrush, no change of underwear, no money. They hailed taxis. Taxis. The king of Greece had to hail a taxi to take his family to the Greek embassy in Rome. When they arrived, the ambassador, shocked and terrified of the junta's retribution, was hesitant. The reality of exile hit them immediately. They were radioactive. Supporting them meant angering the new military dictatorship in Athens. That first night in Rome was the longest of Irene's life. They stayed at the embassy, sleeping on makeshift beds. The phone didn't stop ringing, but it wasn't friends calling to help. It was the press, hungry for the story of the fallen dynasty. Irene looked in the mirror that night and saw a stranger. Yesterday, she was a crown princess. Today she was a stateless refugee. The palaces, the pianos, the friends, the landscape of her childhood, it was all gone. A literal iron curtain had slammed down between her and her past. The early months in Rome were a study in humiliation. The family had no access to their personal funds in Greece. The junta had frozen everything. They relied on the financial charity of their royal relatives in Denmark and Spain. They moved into a rented villa in Rome. It was a far cry from Tatoi. For the first time in her life, Irene had to worry about household budgets. She had to learn how to live without a retinue of servants. But while the king was frantic, traveling to London, lobbying governments, trying to organize resistance, Irene began to go quiet. The trauma of the escape had shifted something inside her. She watched her mother, Frederica, aged 10 years and 10 months. The loss of the throne broke Frederica's heart in a way the war never had. Irene became the caretaker of her mother's grief. She absorbed the toxicity of their situation so the others wouldn't have to. It was during these dark days in Rome that Irene began to ask the dangerous questions. If I am not a princess in a palace, then what am I? If God allowed this to happen, what is the nature of God? What is the point of attachment to material things if they can be taken away in a single night? While her brother plotted his return to the throne, Irene began to plot a different kind of journey. She didn't want to go back to Athens to rule. She wanted to go somewhere else, somewhere where the royal highness didn't matter. She began to read books on Eastern philosophy. She began to meditate. The noise of European politics, the coups, the counter-coups, the arguments about constitutions started to sound like meaningless chatter to her ears. The princess had died on that plane ride to Rome. The seeker was being born. And soon she would make a decision that would shock her conservative European relatives. She would take her mother, pack their bags again, and head east. Not to a palace, but to an ashram. To find yourself, sometimes you must lose the world. By 1969, the novelty of being exiled royalty in Rome had worn off. The glamorous dinner parties with Italian aristocrats, the paparazzi chases on the Via Veneto, the endless political brooding of the Greek community. It all felt hollow to Princess Irene. She was 27 years old, a woman in her prime, yet she felt like a ghost haunting the ruins of her own past. Her brother, King Constantine, was fighting a political war from London, trying to wrestle his throne back from the colonels in Athens. Her sister, Queen Sofia, was in Madrid, navigating the treacherous waters of General Franco's dictatorship, trying to secure the future of the Spanish monarchy. But Irene looked at the map and chose a direction that no one expected. She didn't look west, to the power centers of London or Washington. She looked east. In a move that baffled European high society, Queen Mother Frederica and Princess Irene packed their bags and moved to India. They didn't go as tourists. They didn't go for a brief spiritual holiday. They went to live. To understand why a queen and a princess would move to India, we have to understand the intellectual hunger that drove them. Queen Frederica, for all her political ruthlessness, was a woman of deep, almost desperate spiritual curiosity. She was a student of theoretical physics and philosophy. She had met Professor T.M.P. Mahadevan, a renowned Indian philosopher and head of the Department of Philosophy at the University of Madras, at a conference. Mahadevan taught Advaita Vedanta, the philosophy of non-dualism. In simple terms, it teaches that the separation between the individual soul and the universal reality is an illusion. Everything is one. For Irene, who had just seen her entire identity, her country, her title, her home, stripped away in a single night, this philosophy was like water in a desert. If reality is an illusion, then losing a throne is not a tragedy. It is just a shifting of shadows. In 1969, they settled in Madras. They didn't live in a palace. They lived in a modest, rented house in the Adyar district. For the Greek diaspora and the European royal cousins, this was madness. Why are they living in the heat and dust of India? Have they lost their minds? But for Irene, it was sanity. Life in Madras was a shock to the system, and Irene loved it. Imagine the contrast. At Tatoi Palace, dinner was a formal affair with silverware and servants. In Madras, Irene and her mother ate simple vegetarian meals, often sitting on the floor or at simple tables. They wore cotton saris or simple Western clothes. The humid air smelled of jasmine, incense, and exhaust fumes, a far cry from the pine forests of Greece. Irene enrolled as a student. She wasn't Her Royal Highness here. She was just Irene. She studied Sanskrit. She spent hours every day in the library of the Theosophical Society, a beautiful sprawling campus filled with ancient banyan trees and silence. Her daily routine was disciplined. She would wake up early for meditation. She would practice the piano for hours. Music remained her tether to the physical world. Then, she would attend lectures by Professor Mahadevan. They discussed the nature of the self. They discussed the futility of ego. For a woman raised in a system entirely designed to inflate the ego, this was deprogramming. Irene began to dismantle the princess piece by piece. She stopped dyeing her hair. She stopped wearing jewelry. She stopped caring about the protocol of who walks into a room first. There is a wonderful understated anecdote from this time. A visiting European diplomat tracked them down in Madras, expecting to find them living in colonial grandeur. He found the queen mother and the princess sitting on a porch, swatting mosquitoes, debating a verse from the Upanishads. When he tried to bow and use formal titles, Irene reportedly smiled and said, "Please don't. Here, we are just students." It wasn't that she rejected her heritage. It was that she transcended it. She realized that being a princess was just a role she was playing in this lifetime, like an actor on a stage. It wasn't who she was. During these years, Irene didn't completely abandon her music. In fact, her playing deepened. She began to perform professionally, not for vanity, but often for charity. One of her most famous moments from this era wasn't a philosophical debate, but a concert. She performed in London's Royal Festival Hall and in the United States. Critics were skeptical. They expected a royal amateur. They expected a gimmick. What they got was a professional concert pianist of serious caliber. Irene played with a rigorous, almost austere intensity. She didn't smile at the audience. She didn't play to the crowd. She played for the music itself. One review noted that she played with the solitude of someone who knows what it means to be alone. Her music was the bridge between her two worlds, the discipline of the West and the spiritual depth of the East. But even as she found peace in India, she remained fiercely protective of her mother. The bond between Irene and Frederica was intense. In India, they were isolated from the rest of the family. They only had each other. Irene became the guardian of her mother's legacy. While the world demonized Queen Frederica as the bad woman of Greek politics, Irene saw only the vulnerable, brilliant seeker. She cooked for her, traveled with her, and shielded her from the harsh attacks of the Greek press. This codependency would define Irene's emotional life. She didn't need a husband because she had a purpose. She was the keeper of the fallen queen. The Indian ideal could not last forever. By the late 1970s, Queen Frederica's health was declining. They began to spend more time back in Europe, specifically in Spain, to be closer to Queen Sofia and her children. In February 1981, tragedy struck with the sudden violence of a lightning bolt. Queen Frederica decided to undergo a blepharoplasty in Madrid. It was supposed to be a routine cosmetic procedure. Irene was with her, of course. She held her hand as she went into the operating room. There are conflicting accounts of what happened next. Some say it was a reaction to the anesthesia. Others say it was heart failure. But the result was the same. The Queen Mother, the Iron Queen, the woman who had survived wars, coups, and exile, died on a plastic surgeon's table. She was 63 years old. The shock was cataclysmic. Irene was in the waiting room when they told her. The person who had been the center of her universe for 39 years was gone. The funeral in Tatoi was a political nightmare. The Greek government, now a republic and hostile to the royals, reluctantly allowed the family to return for a few hours, only to bury her. They were given a time limit. They could not stay overnight. Irene stood by the grave at Tatoi, surrounded by police and hostile crowds, shouting anti-royal slogans outside the gates. It was a brutal farewell. They had to bury their mother and then immediately board a plane to leave the country again. The grief broke something in Irene, but it also solidified her steel. She did not collapse. She did not scream. She stood straight, her face a mask of stoic sorrow. With Frederica gone, Irene was truly an orphan of history. Her father was dead. Her mother was dead. Her brother was living in London. She was 39 years old, unmarried with no children and no home. The Indian chapter was closed. She could not go back to Madras alone. The house was too full of memories of her mother. She stood at a crossroads. She could have moved to London to be a socialite. She could have retired to a quiet life in Switzerland. Instead, she made a choice that would define the second half of her life. She turned to her sister. Queen Sofia of Spain was, by 1981, living her own difficult reality. She was the queen of a restored democracy, revered by the Spanish people, but her marriage to King Juan Carlos was becoming increasingly complex and lonely. Juan Carlos was charming, popular, and a hero of the transition to democracy, but he was also a man of wandering affections. Sofia was lonely in the vast Zarzuela palace. She needed an ally. She needed someone who knew the old language of their childhood, someone who understood the burden of duty, someone who would never betray her. She asked Irene to stay, and Irene stayed. She didn't move into a grand guest wing. She moved into a small apartment within the palace complex. She brought her books, her few clothes, and her piano. This was the beginning of the Spanish years. To the outside world, it looked like Irene was just the spinster sister, crashing on the queen's couch. The Spanish press, often cruel, nicknamed the royal sisters the Greeks. But the reality was a profound partnership. Irene became the anchor of the Spanish royal family. She was the crazy aunt to the royal children, Felipe, Elena, and Cristina. She was the one who taught them about karma and vegetarianism. She was the one who didn't care about protocol. And for Sofia, Irene was the lifeline. When the king was away hunting or attending to private business, the two sisters would sit together in the evenings, speaking in English and Greek, watching TV, or listening to music. Irene provided the emotional warmth that the cold marble of the palace lacked. However, Irene was not content to just be a companion. The lessons of India were still burning inside her. She couldn't be a queen, and she didn't want to be a socialite. She needed a mission. One evening, watching the news about the famine in Ethiopia or the slaughter of cows in Europe, Irene realized she had a platform. She had a famous name even if she had no power. She decided to start a revolution of her own, not with guns, like the colonels who stole her country, but with cows. In 1986, Irene founded World in Harmony. It wasn't a typical royal charity where ladies in hats drank tea. Irene ran it like a military operation of compassion. Her philosophy was simple: direct action, no bureaucracy. She wanted to help. and she started with the most unusual project imaginable for a Greek princess, shipping cows to India. But the story of the cows is just the tip of the iceberg. The organization World in Harmony, which she founded and ran consistently from 1986 to 2023, carried a much larger mission. It wasn't a spontaneous act of charity, but an effort to educate about peace, harmony between humans and nature, and life itself. She wanted to prove that compassion is a practical action, not just empty words. She knew this from her time in Madras. She knew from her time in Madras that many poor families needed milk to survive. She also knew that due to European milk quotas, thousands of healthy dairy cows were being slaughtered in Europe. She connected the dots. She chartered planes. She personally oversaw the logistics of flying hundreds of cows from Europe to India to be given to poor families. The press mocked her at first. "The cow princess," they sneered. But Irene didn't care. She was saving lives, and she was saving animals. It was the practical application of the Advaita Vedanta she had learned. All life is one. If the cow suffers, I suffer. This marked the emergence of the mature Irene. She was no longer just the exile or the student. She was a woman of action. She began to travel to war zones, to disaster sites, always quietly, often without the press knowing. She had found her kingdom. It wasn't a piece of land on a map, it was the kingdom of compassion. And she ruled it alone, without a king, without a husband, answerable only to her conscience. But the 1990s were approaching, and with them, a new storm was gathering over the family. The past was not done with them yet. The Greek government was about to launch a final assault on the former royal family, stripping them of the last thing they had left, their very identity. And Irene, the woman who claimed to care nothing for titles, would find herself in a courtroom, fighting for her name. They can take the passport, but they cannot take the blood. By the 1990s, Princess Irene had crafted a life of quiet contradiction. She lived in a palace but slept in a room as simple as a nun's cell. She was the sister of a queen and a king, yet she spent her days organizing shipments of milk powder and arguing with cargo pilots about cow transport. She had found a rhythm, part royal, part monk, part humanitarian. But history has a way of circling back to finish what it started. For decades, the status of the Greek royal family had been in legal limbo. They were exiled, yes, but they were still Greek. They traveled on Danish diplomatic passports, but in their hearts, they were citizens of the Hellenic Republic, even if the Republic didn't want them. In 1994, the ghost of politics rose up to haunt them one last time. The Greek government, led by the socialist Prime Minister Andreas Papandreou, decided to settle the royal question with a sledgehammer. It began with a law passed in the Greek parliament, Law 2215/1994. It was cold, bureaucratic, and devastating. The law stripped King Constantine, Queen Anne-Marie, Princess Irene, and all their children of their Greek citizenship. It confiscated their private properties without compensation. And, most painfully, it forbade them from using the name of Greece. Overnight, Irene became a legal ghost. Imagine the psychological violence of this. Irene had been born Greek. She had run refugee camps for Greek children. She had represented Greece on the world stage as a pianist. Her father was buried in Greek soil. And now, a piece of paper in Athens declared that she did not exist. The government demanded that if they wanted passports, they had to adopt a surname. They suggested Glücksburg, a name the family rejected as a foreign insult. The king and Irene maintained that of Greece was not just a title, but their identity. "I was born Irene of Greece," she said privately. "I will die Irene of Greece." For Irene, who had spent years in India learning to detach from the ego, this was the ultimate test. It was easy to say, "I am not my title," when you still have a passport. It is much harder when border control stops you because your documents are invalid. She was effectively stateless. The Spanish government, out of respect for Queen Sofia, granted Irene Spanish citizenship by naturalization. But it wasn't until 2018 that a final legal milestone was reached. Irene officially received Spanish citizenship and renounced her Greek citizenship. After more than half a century, the woman who was once the crown princess of Greece now, on paper, completely belongs to another country. But the wound was deep. It wasn't about the travel document, it was about the rejection. Her motherland wasn't just exiling her, it was deleting her. The family did something unprecedented. They sued Greece. They took their case to the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg. It was a humiliating spectacle. Kings and princesses are raised to be above the fray, to be symbols of unity. Now they were plaintiffs in a lawsuit against their own people. Irene was a key part of this lawsuit. She was a co-plaintiff alongside her brother and her aunt, Princess Catherine. The press painted them as greedy royals demanding money. The reality was more complex. They were fighting for the principle of property rights, rights that belonged to every citizen, even unpopular ones. The legal battle dragged on for years. It was an ugly, bruising public fight. Every time Irene appeared in public during this time, the shadow of the lawsuit hung over her. She was the greedy princess to the Greek left and the martyred princess to the royalist right. In November 2000, the court delivered its verdict. It was a partial victory. The court ruled that the Greek government had violated their human rights by seizing their property without compensation. They ordered Greece to pay a settlement. The king received 12 million euros. Irene received 900,000 euros. It was a fraction of the value of the estates, but the money didn't matter. The family immediately announced they would not keep a single cent. They used the money to create the Anna Maria Foundation to help victims of natural disasters in Greece. It was Irene's quiet revenge. The government said she wasn't Greek. She took the government's money and gave it back to the Greek people. "You can take my house," her actions seemed to say, "but you cannot stop me from serving my people." Just as the legal dust was settling, Irene faced a new, more intimate enemy. In 2002, at the age of 60, she was diagnosed with breast cancer. For a woman who had lived a life of ascetic health, vegetarianism, meditation, no smoking, no alcohol, it felt like a betrayal of the body. But Irene's reaction to her illness became one of the most inspiring chapters of her life. Most royals hide their illnesses. They disappear into Swiss clinics and issue vague medical bulletins. Irene did the opposite. She treated cancer with the same radical acceptance she had learned in the ashrams of Madras. She underwent chemotherapy in Madrid. The treatment was brutal. She lost her hair. She was exhausted. She was in pain, but she refused to wear a wig. In the rigid, image-obsessed world of the Spanish court, this was revolutionary. She attended family gatherings, concerts, and even public events with her head covered only by a simple scarf, or sometimes with her short, thinning hair exposed. She smiled. She didn't hide the puffiness of her face or the pallor of her skin. She famously told a friend, "This is just another experience. It is a lesson I have to learn." During her recovery, she leaned heavily on her sister, Queen Sofia. The roles reversed. Sofia, usually the one leaning on Irene for emotional support, became the nurse. The queen canceled appointments to sit with her sister during treatments. The bond between them, forged in childhood and tempered by exile, became unbreakable. Irene beat the cancer, but the experience changed her. It stripped away the last vestiges of vanity. She emerged from the illness even more eccentric, even more liberated. She began to speak more openly about her beliefs in alternative medicine, her fascination with UFOs, and her belief in the interconnectedness of the universe. She became the wise woman of the palace, the one you went to when the doctors couldn't help you, or when your soul was hurting. Irene had survived her own crisis, but the house she was living in, the Spanish monarchy, was about to catch fire. For decades, King Juan Carlos had been the untouchable hero of Spain. But in the late 2000s and early 2010s, the facade began to crack. Rumors of his infidelities moved from whispers to headlines. Then came the Botswana elephant hunting scandal. Then came the corruption case against Iñaki Urdangarin, the husband of Irene's niece, the Infanta Cristina. The Noos case tore the family apart. The king and the then Prince Felipe had to distance themselves from Cristina to save the institution. The family was fractured. Cristina was ostracized, stripped of her title as Duchess of Palma, and eventually ended up in court. In this civil war within the Zarzuela Palace, Irene took a position that was pure Irene. She chose the human over the institution. While the king and Prince Felipe had to turn their backs on Cristina for political reasons, Irene refused to cut ties. She was frequently seen traveling to Geneva to visit Cristina and her children. She appeared in photographs walking next to the disgraced couple, not endorsing their alleged crimes but endorsing their humanity. She was the bridge. She was the one person who could talk to Felipe and Cristina and Queen Sofia without being accused of having an agenda. When Queen Sofia was humiliated by the public revelations of her husband's affairs, the Spanish public saw one constant image: the Queen, head held high, and one step behind her, Princess Irene. Irene didn't give interviews defending her sister. She didn't need to. Her presence was the defense. By standing there, she was saying she is not alone. As Irene entered her 70s, she settled comfortably into the role of the eccentric aunt. The Spanish press, which had once been suspicious of her, grew to feel a strange affection for Tia Peku. She became known for her disregard for fashion. She wore comfortable sandals and loose trousers to events where others wore couture. She was spotted at the hairdresser reading books on metaphysics. She was the antithesis of the modern, polished, Instagram-ready royale. There is a story that encapsulates her indifference to status. At a high society wedding in Spain where every guest was dripping in diamonds and designer silk, Irene arrived wearing a simple decades-old ensemble. A snobbish guest allegedly whispered, "Doesn't she have a mirror?" Another guest replied, "She has a mirror. She just doesn't look at what you look at." She continued her work with World in Harmony. But even that work evolved. She became deeply concerned with the environment, long before it was a trendy royal cause. She spoke about the energy of the earth, about the suffering of animals in factory farms. She was a vegetarian, a pacifist, and a mystic, living in the heart of a Bourbon court known for hunting and bullfighting. She was a living contradiction, yet she fit perfectly. She was the conscience of the palace. By 2018, Irene's pace began to slow. The cancer was gone, but age is a thief that never rests. She began to look frailer. Her walk became unsteady. In 2018, her beloved sister Sofia turned 80. Irene was there, of course, leading the applause, but observers noticed that Irene was now leaning on Sofia just as much as Sofia leaned on her. The two sisters, now white-haired and fragile, moved like a single organism. Then came the rumors. Whispers in the Spanish press suggested that Irene was struggling with memory loss, perhaps the early stages of cognitive decline, the long goodbye. The palace never officially confirmed a diagnosis, respecting her privacy, but the signs were there in the way Sofia would gently guide her sister by the elbow, or the way Irene would sometimes look lost in the middle of a crowd. This adds a final poignant layer to her story. The woman who had spent her life cultivating the mind, studying philosophy, memorizing intricate piano concertos, and learning Sanskrit, was now facing the fading of that very mind. But even in this twilight, there is a dignity. In recent public appearances, Irene still smiles. It is a gentle, vague smile, but it is there. She holds her sister's hand. She has walked away from a kingdom. She has walked away from a marriage. She has walked away from a country that rejected her. And now she is slowly, quietly, walking away from the memories of it all. But the story isn't quite over. As she sits in the gardens of Zarzuela, perhaps listening to the wind in the trees, she is the last guardian of a world that has vanished. In the end, we do not own our history. We do not even own our memories. We only own the love we gave. The corridors of the Zarzuela Palace in Madrid are long and silent. It is a working palace, filled with the bustling energy of the current king, Felipe VI, and his queen, Letizia. It is a place of state dinners, diplomatic cables, and the constant hum of political machinery. But in a quiet wing of the residence, far from the cameras, time moves at a different speed. Here, two elderly women sit together. One is a queen, the other is a princess. They are in their 80s now. Their hair is white, their steps are slow. They speak in a language that few others in the palace understand, a mix of English, Greek, and German, the secret code of a childhood that vanished 80 years ago. They are the survivors. They are the last wreckage of a shipwreck that happened half a century ago. As we approach the end of Princess Irene's story, we are not looking at a tragedy. We are looking at a masterclass in the art of letting go. She spent her youth letting go of her country. She spent her middle age letting go of her ego. And now, in her final act, she is learning to let go of the world itself. The final crushing blow to the Greek triumvirate came in January 2023. King Constantine II, the brother whom Irene had followed into exile, the man who had piloted that terrifying plane ride in 1967, died in Athens at the age of 82. His death was a seismic event for the sisters. For decades, the three of them had been a fortress. They had faced the colonels, the socialists, the lawsuits, and the insults of the press together. Constantine was the head, Sophia was the heart, and Irene was the soul. Now, the head was gone. The funeral in Athens was a moment of surreal historical vertigo. The Greek government, which had stripped them of their citizenship and banned them for so long, allowed the funeral to take place, though, as a private citizen, not a king. But the people, the Greek people, had a different vote. Thousands of mourners lined the streets of Athens. They chanted, "Long live the king," and threw flowers at the hearse. It was the vindication they had waited 50 years for. And there, in the center of the grief, was Princess Irene. The images from that day are heart-wrenching. Irene appeared in a wheelchair looking frail, her face etched with a confusion and sorrow that went beyond words. She was pushed by her nephews. She held tightly to Queen Sophia's hand. For Irene, this wasn't just a funeral. It was a return to the scene of the crime. She was back in the city she had fled in the dead of night. She was breathing the air of the country that said she didn't exist. And she was burying the brother who had been the center of her gravity. Observers noted that Irene looked fragile as glass. The fierce, independent traveler who had trekked through India was gone. In her place was a sweet, elderly lady who seemed to be drifting in and out of the present moment. But even in her frailty, she insisted on being there. She insisted on saying goodbye. It is the open secret of the Spanish court, whispered with sadness and respect. Princess Irene, is slowly fading. The long goodbye, cognitive decline, is a thief that steals the person while leaving the body behind. For a woman like Irene, whose life was defined by her sharp intellect, her musical genius, and her philosophical depth, this seems like a cruel irony. But those who know her say that Irene is handling this final challenge with the same spiritual acceptance she applied to everything else. According to the philosophy of Advaita Vedanta, she studied so passionately in India. The mind and its memories are just tools. They are not the self. The true self is the observer behind the thoughts. As her memory fades, perhaps Irene is not losing herself. Perhaps she is finally achieving the ultimate detachment she practiced for decades. She no longer plays the piano in public. The complex concertos of Bach and Mozart, once her solace, are now silent. The World in Harmony Foundation has wound down its operations. The cows have been sent, the aid has been delivered, the work is done. Her life has shrunk to the size of her sister's hand. Queen Sophia has become her primary caregiver. It is a moving reversal of roles. For 40 years, Irene was the rock for Sophia. Now Sophia is the guide for Irene. The queen, known for her stoicism, is fiercely protective of her little sister. She ensures Irene is never alone, never confused, never frightened. They are often seen in Palma de Mallorca during the summers, being driven in a golf cart or sitting in a restaurant by the sea. Irene smiles at the waiters. She smiles at the sky. She may not remember exactly what year it is, or which government is in power, but she seems to have retained her essential nature, kindness. So what is the legacy of Princess Irene of Greece? She will not leave behind a dynasty. She has no children to carry her name. She will not leave behind a great palace or a political treaty. But in an age of celebrity narcissism, her legacy is perhaps more important than any monument. She leaves behind the example of the anti-princess. She showed us that dignity is quiet. While other royals fought for attention, sold their stories, and monetized their titles, Irene did the opposite. She never sold an interview. She never wrote a tell-all book about her mother or her sister. She kept the secrets. She valued loyalty over currency. She showed us that happiness is internal. She had every reason to be bitter. She lost her father young. She lost her crown. She lost her home. She was humiliated by governments. She had cancer. She never found a life partner. By modern standards, her life could be called a failure. But Irene was not unhappy. By all accounts, she was the most centered and peaceful member of her family. She found joy not in what she had, but in what she was. She proved that you can live in a palace and be a monk, and you can live in exile and be a queen. She redefined the spare. In royal history, the spare sibling is often a tragic figure, rebellious, lost, or dissolute. Irene reinvented the role. She showed that the spare can be the support beam that holds the whole house up. Without Irene, Queen Sophia might not have survived the loneliness of her marriage. Without Irene, the Greek family might have fractured under the stress of exile. She was the glue. There is a concept in Indian philosophy called Maya, the illusion of the physical world. It teaches that our titles, our bank accounts, our bodies, and even our histories are just a dream. The only reality is the spirit. Irene of Greece lived her life as if she knew this secret all along. She wore the title of Royal Highness loosely, like a coat that didn't quite fit. She wore the label of exile without shame. She wore the label of spinster without regret. Now, as the shadows lengthen in the gardens of Madrid, she is preparing for the final journey. She is preparing to drop the body, just as she dropped the crown. One can imagine her sitting at her piano one last time, perhaps in her mind, playing a chord that resolves all the dissonance of her life. The noise of the tanks in 1967 is gone. The screaming of the crowds is gone. The lawyers and the politicians are gone. There is only the music, and then the silence. Someday soon, the news will come. The flags in Madrid, and perhaps even in Athens, will fly at half-mast. The obituaries will be written, listing her titles: Princess of Greece and Denmark, Sister of Queens, Daughter of Kings. They will talk about the historical figure. They will talk about the coups and the exile. But somewhere in India, in a small village where a family owns a cow that fed their children because a strange Greek woman chartered a plane 40 years ago, they will remember her differently. And in the Zarzuela Palace, there will be an empty chair next to Queen Sophia, a silence where a laugh used to be. Irene of Greece walked away from the fairy tale to find the truth. And in a world that is constantly shouting, constantly demanding to be seen, constantly fighting for power, the woman who chose loneliness, the woman who chose silence, might just be the only one who truly won. She was the princess who didn't need a kingdom. She carried it inside her all along.